Resources Board and the Climate Change Center. Is that correct? Office of Climate Change. And before Edie starts, I want to at least mention that the last seminar in the series, which is listed as to be determined, we are actually going to have a climate change panel and question and answer. The final one will not be a lecture, but we'll have 5 or 6 people up here, some of whom have spoken during these seminars to answer questions that you might have. So that's coming up in, I guess, 4 weeks. So for now, I'd like to introduce Edie, and we'll be speaking today about AB 32 and the scoping plan.
Let's see if I can figure it out. Never actually. Okay. Can you hear me? We're gonna switch on something. How close do I have to get? Can you guys hear me? It's not on. So, can they hear me? All right. So, my name is Edie Chang. I'm with the Air Resources Board, and I'm in the Office of Climate Change. And I'm actually sort of curious, at least for the folks in the room, how many of them, I'm sort of looking around to see how many people have visitors badges and how many people are from, so how many people work in this building? So mostly Cal EPA agencies. And then I'm sort of curious, the folks that are from that are not in the building, kind of what your background is. Anybody? Okay. City of Sacramento. Anyone else? Oh, okay. Well, I was sort of curious. Basically, it helps me understand kind of where your perspective is and what you might be interested in, and kind of how to tailor. Because what I've got is a presentation. It's a fairly generic presentation about what's going on at the Air Resources Board, what we're doing with respect to climate change. Most of the talks in this series have been talking about climate change impacts and adaptation. And what I'm really going to talk about is sort of from the state of California's perspective, what are we doing? So what's the response to this climate change problem, and how are we handling it? So AB 32 is actually, I guess I'll just, okay, so where it all began. When Governor Schwarzenegger was elected, one of the things that he put us on a path towards is tackling the climate change problem. And he signed an executive order in, I have to look, June 1st, 2005. And he basically said, the argument's over. We got to start doing something about climate change. And he set out targets for the state of California. He looked around and he said, we need to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions. And he looked to international targets and what other folks were doing. And he said, we need to reduce California's emissions back to 1990 levels by 2020. And we need to get 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. These are the kinds of numbers that other folks are talking about are necessary on a worldwide basis to actually make an impact on climate change. So, and I think you've had lots and lots of talks that have a lot more detail about the impact of climate change, why the governor is so concerned about this. So this is a slide that basically shows you, if we act now, and if everybody in the world acted now, we could limit the impacts of climate change. But if we do nothing, the impacts could be very, very severe in California. So what is AB 32? AB 32 is basically a piece of legislation that was passed in 2006. It set into statute the governor's goal of getting back to 1990 levels by 2020. It sets up the Air Resources Board as the responsible agency for developing a plan to describe how we're going to get back to these 1990 levels. It puts us in the lead, but it also acknowledges the importance of coordinating across other state agencies. It's sort of easy to think, oh, it's a gaseous problem. It should be the Air Resources Board. Climate change is really a different problem than any problem we've ever dealt with at the Air Board. It covers so many different aspects of the economy, and it's really about energy, how energy is being produced and consumed in California. So it really requires us to draw from lots and lots of other state agencies also. So this climate action team that the governor created in 2005, it's chaired by Cal EPA. That's continuing to help us coordinate and work with other state agencies to make sure that agencies like the CEC, the California Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, California Department of Forestry, Department of Water Resources are all involved in these efforts. And it doesn't take away any other agencies. It tells ARB, you guys got to do this plan, but it doesn't take away any other agency's authority to act. I'm going to talk a little bit just about the climate action team. As I mentioned, this is really the mechanism to help us coordinate across state agencies. It's chaired by Cal EPA. It acknowledges that greenhouse gas reductions cut across all agency boundaries and that we aren't the lead on everything. The Air Resources Board doesn't have authority to regulate everything. And there are other areas where other state agencies are going to play important roles. And they're also working on just sort of coordinating all of the state agencies, making sure we're all headed the same direction, that we're helping each other out. Okay, this is our timeline for AB 32. And you probably can't tell just by looking at it, it's kind of innocuous, but it's actually a really, really aggressive timeline. The legislature was concerned that we'd spend too much time planning to do stuff, not enough time actually reducing emissions. So the first thing they said was, ARB, you need to identify a list of early actions, things that you can adopt almost immediately. And we want them to be effective, to be enforceable by January 1st, 2010. So that's that first box over there. Identify these measures that we know we can do now, they're kind of the no-brainer things, and let's just do them. So that was the first thing. Our board approved a list of 44 early action measures in September of 2007. Some of them are regulatory rules that we're going to do, like requiring that ships, when ships come into ports, they run their engines usually to supply electricity because the crew stays on board the ship. And what we're requiring is that instead of running the engines and burning all of that, it's not even diesel fuel, it's called bunker fuel. It's way worse than diesel fuel. Instead of running their engines, they're going to plug in. So there's going to be an electrical supply at the port. They can plug in and they run off grid power, which is a lot cleaner. So it's good for greenhouse gas emissions. It's also great from a toxic standpoint because all that stuff they were putting up in the air before, a lot of toxic air contaminants. So it's good for the communities that are around the ports also. So that's a good win-win. That's one of the early actions that we're doing. They also required us to set up a reporting system so that the largest stationary sources of emissions are going to report their emissions to us. And, you know, I mentioned that we're supposed to be getting back to 1990 levels by 2020. But one of the other things we had to figure out was, what is that 1990? So that was a huge effort to go back and kind of recreate what was going on 16 years ago in California. So the Air Resources Board worked really closely with the CEC in that effort to true up the inventory. The CEC has actually been keeping the inventory for okay. The CEC has been actually keeping the California's greenhouse gas inventory for at least a decade. And as part of AB 32, that responsibility shifted over to the Air Resources Board. Okay. I don't know what the next slide is. Okay. Okay, the next slide, this is sort of our process in terms of developing the scoping plan. So these are the major public events that we've had in the past. League of Cities and counties and all of those folks to try to work through something that we think can actually lead us to better land use out into the future. This isn't a big measure for the 2020 timeframe. You don't get a lot of movement. But if we're going to have that huge 80% reduction by 2050, we got to tackle land use. So it's a big measure for the future. It's the kind of thing we need to transform the way that we work, and so we need to get started now. So energy is kind of similar. It's the other big sector. And again, there's kind of three main components. One is energy efficiency, and I'd actually probably say energy efficiency and conservation. So use less energy, and if you use it, make it really, really efficient. California has really tough appliance standards and building standards. CEC is looking at the next round of those, so making those standards tougher. And there's also things that, like, water conservation. I can't remember what the number is. Something like 25% of the electricity in California is used to move water. We move so much water in this state. And so if we're using less water, we have to move less water, and that's good for greenhouse gases also. Probably just a good thing to do. Renewable energy. So to the extent that we can move our portfolio into zero emitting technologies, that's a really good thing to do. Right now, there's a state law that says that investor-owned utilities have to have 20% of their retail load supplied by renewable energy by 20. So there's actually a requirement on the books right now. They call it the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. It's a 20% RPS for investor-owned utilities. The major publicly owned utilities, that would be Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utilities District, also have similar board policies. They're not regulated by the PUC, but they are pursuing the same policies. There's been a lot of talk about, should we increase the renewable portfolio standard? So should we make utilities push beyond 20% in 2010? There's been talk about 33% RPS, and then you get into a big discussion about, is that cost effective? Is that the best way to get the reduction? But the 20% is on the books, and it's a requirement right now. And then the last item is, to the extent that we still need to have electricity that's generated from fossil fuels, whether it's for kind of balancing out the grid or for serving our load at night or when the wind's not blowing or in dry years, we want to make those generators as clean as they can possibly be. And we actually made California made a pretty big step in this direction. The legislature passed a law that said that from now on, utilities can't sign long-term contracts for electric power that's dirtier than a combined cycle natural gas power plant. So that's sort of the cleanest thing out there on the fossil fuel side. And what that means is a utility can't sign a long-term contract to buy more coal power. So if someone out there is building a coal-fired power plant in Nevada and they're thinking to themselves, this is great, I can sell the electricity to California, they're not going to be able to under that law. Okay, I'm going to get back into the scoping plan and sort of what are we trying to do in the scoping plan. First and foremost is meet the legal requirement. We got to get back to 1990 levels by 2020, but we also recognize that that's not the end of it. I mean, 2020 is kind of a way station on the way to 2050. So we don't want to do things that are only for the short term. We want to do things that put us on the right path to get out into to 2050. It seems kind of obvious. We want to maximize the benefits to California and minimize the harm to California. We're not interested in ruining our economy. We want to maximize the societal benefits, including environmental impacts, air quality impacts. This next bullet about providing leadership and influence other governments is really important. California is the 15th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, and we're about 2% of the world's emissions. So we're kind of small when you look at it in that. We could turn off California, probably wouldn't make a huge impact globally. But what we can do is provide a model for how you can tackle the problem, how you can look at the whole economy and pull together a comprehensive system to tackle everything, not just the power plants, not just the cars, but how does it all fit together? And to the extent that the measures that we're looking at can be exported to other states or other countries, and they can build on the technical work that we've already done, we think that's a really important thing. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question is there an equivalent national or international climate action team? And I'm not actually the expert on this. There are probably other people in the room who know better than I. But at the federal level, there hasn't been as much action from US EPA. This administration hasn't really been interested in moving forward on climate change the way that California and some of the other states have. There is legislation that's pending in Congress to establish a federal climate change program, and I think it's stuck in Congress right now. They don't think it's going to get out. So there are some federal activities, and we've been talking with folks in the federal government. We've also been talking with folks internationally. There are things going on in other parts of the country. For example, the northeastern states have set up a regional program to look at power plants in the Northeast. The European Union has set up a system to look at the large factories and power plants in Europe, but there hasn't been as much crosstalk. Yeah, there actually is a Western Regional Association that's looking at greenhouse gas emissions in the Western region. It's called the Western Climate Initiative, and it's actually not part of the Western Governors Association, but they're helping to manage and administer that program. So they're trying to set up a Western region. Okay. And then the last one is it sort of assuring that emission reductions are equitable across the sectors. At the workshop that we had on Monday, there were a fair number of industry folks there, as you might imagine. We had a lot of discussion about this word equitable and what does equitable mean. And we take great pains to say equitable is not equal. What we're not saying is that everybody has to reduce their emissions by 30%. That may not be possible for some sectors, but some sectors might be able to do more than 30%. For us, it's a matter of balancing what technologies are available, how much do they cost, when might they become available. Should one sector have to bear the burden for everybody? Should everybody have to be at least part of the solution? So these are some of the things that we're trying to balance when we're trying to figure out what's equitable. So in trying to figure out how we're going to put together the scoping plan, we've kind of followed two main paths. One is looking at what's technologically feasible and and how much is that going to cost. And it's a pretty technical effort. It's involved a lot of folks at the Air Resources Board and hundreds of folks, I think, from other state agencies sort of combing through what kinds of things we might be able to do. And then the other one is developing these design options. Okay, so we know that we can clean up a refinery by implementing some kind of technology. What's the best way to do it? The Air Resources Board is really good at doing regulations. But AB 32 gives us some other options besides just saying, hey, refinery, you have to implement some reduction. So let me talk a little bit about the measure development. I think we already talked about, we work with the climate action team for some options, tougher regs, new measures, and then voluntary programs too. Incentives in some cases. There are places that regs don't always work. Measure development. Where we've come to is looking at a series of core measures that we would probably recommend that we implement no matter what else we do. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those core measures again as we go through. So program development, this is kind of the tools I was talking about. So if we know we can implement something, what's the best way to actually get it done? Traditional regulations, I think folks, or especially if you're in this building, you're probably really familiar with them. We do a lot of regulations. One of the things that we're looking at, and it's something that's being talked about a lot and being implemented a lot throughout the rest of the country and the rest of the world, is this cap and trade program. And what a cap and trade program basically is you cap emissions at some level that's going to decrease out into the future. So it's a declining cap. And all the sectors that are in that cap, they have to reduce their emissions, but we're not going to tell this factory he has to reduce it. They just have to figure out the best way. So they can look at the cost of reducing their own emissions. Or they could look at the guy next door who has really cheap emission reduction. And that guy could go further than he has to and sell those emission reductions to the first guy. So it's basically a system where, as a whole, emissions are coming down. We as the government aren't telling you exactly who has to do what. So this is actually the system that they're using in the Northeast states. The RGGI system is a cap and trade system. The European Union has a emissions trading scheme, which sounds evil here that it's a scheme, but that's a normal word there. The EU ETS is also a cap and trade system. The federal legislation that they're looking at is also a cap and trade system. So this is actually a system that, in the greenhouse gas world, is gaining a lot of popularity. We have some experience in the air quality world. There was an acid rain program, which was a cap and trade program. It basically capped the sulfur oxide emissions from power plants around the country, and this is exactly what they did. They capped, and you could trade emissions from power plants. There was also a system, the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Los Angeles did a cap and trade system for oxides of nitrogen. So they started with VOC and NOx, and actually they dropped the VOC part because of concerns about toxic impacts. If you weren't reducing VOCs, you might not be reducing toxic emissions also, and there were a lot of concerns about that. But we actually have a fair amount of regulatory experience in cap and trade programs. Fees and incentives, to the extent that we can harness the marketplace and make people not want to use something or use less of it or use it more efficiently because it costs more, or we can give folks money to try to convince them to do something. Voluntary action, and then offsets, which I'm going to talk about a little bit. If you've heard people talk about kind of these suite of tools, they tend to talk in black and white. Well, you could do regs or you could do cap and trade. It's probably more likely that as we move forward, it'll be a mix of strategies. We have to look at the measure, we have to look at the sector, and what's going to make the most sense in each place. So it's probably going to be a mix. This slide gives you kind of a quick comparison of the tools that I talked about. Regs, they're well understood. If we went down this path, we probably need to do a lot of regs. Regs are really time consuming to do. And it's not just actually doing the regulation isn't nearly as bad as implementing the regulation and then making sure that people are actually following the regulation. So that's actually, regs are a lot of work. Cap and trade offers certainty on the emission reduction because there's a cap. There's a hard cap. Doesn't matter what growth is, there's a cap. Trading offers folks flexibility, and if you talk the economists, they will tell you that cap and trade is probably a lower cost option because we're not telling everybody to reduce emissions. The marketplace should be able to find the cheapest emission reductions. I already talked about there's a lot of momentum moving toward cap and trade programs at the regional level. The Western Climate Initiative is also looking at a cap and trade program at the federal level and at the international level. And we in California, recognizing that there may be a federal program or a national program or a regional program or an international program, I think we need to recognize kind of where things might be headed because we can't be off on our own little island forever. But we also recognize that setting up an effective market with good compliance and enforcement is then so it's not, this one isn't a simple thing to just throw out there either. And then carbon fee, economists love to talk about carbon fee also. One of the big challenges with a carbon fee is you don't exactly know what kind of emission reductions you're going to get. You need to do a lot of analytical work to try to figure out where you need to set the carbon fee so we'd actually hit the 2020 goal. And then a little bit about voluntary actions. ARB thinks voluntary early actions are great. If we can get people to act now, that's better than them waiting out into the future. So we've adopted a policy statement encouraging voluntary reductions. We do recognize we can't just have people showing up with anything and saying, here's a reduction. You need to have protocols in place. You need to make sure they're real reductions and verified. So we're working with our local air districts and CCAR, which is the California Climate Action Registry, to develop quantification protocols. We actually have one protocol that we've already taken to our board, and our board approved it, and it's for forest projects. That one was approved last year. Voluntary rate reductions may be more than just a pat on the back going out into the future, there's a possibility that voluntary reductions could be used to meet your regulatory requirements. So we could set up a regulation on, pick on refineries again. We could set up a regulation for refineries, but say you could also get reductions from somewhere else and use them instead of reducing emissions in the refinery. This is also an option in the cap and trade system. If there are reductions that come from outside the cap, they like to call them offsets. There's a lot of jargon in this world, but offsets from outside the cap, things like forest projects or agricultural projects, could provide flexibility, and they could provide lower cost reductions to help control the cost of the program. Okay, so we're coming out with this draft scoping plan in June, and right now, at the end of May, this is what it looks like we're going to be doing. The scoping plan is going to be based on a strong regulatory foundation. I already talked about the early action measures. There were 44 early action measures. And we're also going to be looking at these core measures of things that we think we need to do no matter what. Together, the early action measures and the core measures are going to be probably over half of the emission reductions that we need. So it's a pretty good chunk of regulations there. We're also going to provide recommendations on as many elements of the approach as we can. And then we're going to have some preliminary evaluations, but we're probably not going to have those all complete. We've had some challenges with the economic modeling, which has sort of impacted our ability to do other analyses as well. So we're probably not going to have all the analyses done, and we're going to come out with a supplement later over the summer. So these core measures that I was talking about, these things that we think we have to do, this gives you an idea of kind of what that list looks like. It's the car standards, which I already talked about earlier, the low carbon fuel standard, which we think is important to transform transportation fuel in California. It's reducing vehicle miles traveled, so addressing VMT, land use, transportation planning, increased energy efficiency, renewable resource development, that's basically the renewable portfolio standard, and then also high global warming potential gases. These are gases that have a much greater impact than their weight. So these are things like refrigerants, SF6, which we use as a tracer gas sometimes in some of our air quality studies. And when they go up into the air, a ton of refrigerant has much, much greater impact in the atmosphere than CO2. And if you've been coming to these seminars, you probably know way more about it than I do. But high global warming potential gases, the use of them, especially the ones that are covered under our legislation, are increasing into the future. And so we recognize we need to figure out ways to better capture these gases when you have the gases in refrigerators and foams and other things that are, we need to figure out ways to collect those and capture them so they're not released into the environment. We need to take them out of products, which they're just being used as propellants. I mean, the purpose is for them to be sprayed into the air. For example, the dusters that you use to clean off your computer keyboard, some of those dusters use high global warming gases as propellants. So we're actually taking a regulation to our board in June that will ban the use of high GWP gases in those dusters. So there's a series of things that we need to do to look at for high GWP. All right, for the remaining tons, we're going to be looking at three approaches: additional regulatory measures, a cap and trade program, or a carbon fee, and we're going to be evaluating those three approaches. As I mentioned, we've had delays in the modeling. So we're not going to be able to have the whole thing put together in the plan out in June. We are going to be coming out with a supplement in the summer, and we'll have an additional workshop to get public input on that supplement. And then we're planning to go to the board, as I said, in December. So after the whole thing's done, and the board approves the plan, the hard part starts. Actually, implementing the plan is way harder than putting it together. We've got 2 years to adopt all of the regulations that are in the plan. So the legislation, like I said, it's really, really important. So we've got 2 years to get all the regulations done. There's some accountability provisions that the legislature's put in to make sure that everyone, not just ARB, but all the other state agencies, is doing all the stuff that they're supposed to. And then enforcement is always the key to actually getting what you think out of this. So this is my last slide. If you want more information, I talked way longer than I planned to, but if anybody has any questions. Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, so the question for the folks on the webcast is, how do we deal with things like fuel price? And if you have lower fuel prices and people have all bought these great fuel efficient cars, do they drive more? When we did the 1493 regulation, and we looked at it, and some other folks have looked at rebound effect, which is basically, you buy a more fuel efficient car to save money, but then and the rebound effect, I think, is something on the order of about 10%. So it's not a huge, I mean, it's significant. We need to make sure that we realize that it's there, but it's not a huge impact on in total, folks are still going to be using less fuel. But I think that, it is, as we're going through the plan, it's actually interesting because a lot of the assumptions and analyses of the things that we're looking at were done when gas prices were much lower than they are. And if you went back and looked at some of those studies now with higher gas prices, the results might be different because we're seeing people drive less now with that. So the question is where it says emission limits for generators, is that just for electricity generators? In the context of this slide, it is. It's basically power plants. And then, are we going to be looking at limits on things like gasoline, diesel fuel, and things like that? Those are actually tackled. Gasoline and diesel fuel are tackled in a couple different ways. One is the low carbon fuel standard. One is that we are also looking at whether there are more measures that we can do at refineries that limit the actual emission. And then I think the other part of it would be to the extent that you can have more efficient cars and use them less, hopefully people will be using less gasoline. Yes, sir. Uh-huh. So the question is, do we anticipate regulations on local government to offset carbon from new development or things like that? There's actually requirements under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, that you have to evaluate and mitigate environmental impacts. And the Attorney General has been very active in making sure that everybody is paying attention to their responsibilities under CEQA. So the Attorney General has been out suing people, if you don't know, over not evaluating the CEQA impacts or mitigating them. So there is an obligation right now for local governments and any project developer to look at greenhouse gas impact. We're actually working with the Office of Planning and Research on trying to put together some additional guidelines on CEQA they're actually going to be doing CEQA guidelines for greenhouse gases, and we're going to be providing technical input to that work. But right now there already is an obligation. Kind of, I think, it's a little bit of an unnerving time because the regulatory landscape is quite clear, but people know you have to evaluate, you have to try to mitigate. Well, there's actually, in terms of CEQA, OPR is required to do CEQA guidelines. I think they're supposed to finish them this year, and then they have to go through a regulatory process next year. So OPR is in the process of working through that, and we're providing them with technical assistance on that. And we actually are also doing protocols for local government to help. There's a couple of them. One is to help count the emissions that local governments have. So you just want to know, like, what's your carbon footprint. So we're working on those, and then we're also going to be working on some best practices for local government, along with the Institute for Local. There's actually a number of things coming down the pipe. Any other questions? Cheryl, I don't know. I was going to tell all the ARB people you're not allowed to ask questions. I actually don't know the answer to that question. I think we're about 26%. Are we no, we're like number 2 in the world now. Is that right? So we're only number 2 now. China passed us. Has EPA passed anything for a goal? I don't think so. I'm looking at Jeff in the back because he's actually. Does EPA have a goal? Okay, so for the webcast, the answer is there's not. EPA doesn't currently have a goal, but the legislation that's in Congress right now would provide a goal, and it has a limited chance of making it out of Congress this session. So people are thinking maybe early to mid 2009. So the president apparently has started talking about some targets. Would that be for the webcast bill? Any other questions? Thank you all. Oh, one more in the back. The report card, so the question is, can we say more about the report card? The report card is actually a legislative requirement. So under that requirement, all state agencies have to report every year on how they're making progress towards the things that they said they were going to do as part of the climate action team. Actually did a report to talk about what they can do, and then the scoping plan will probably lay out additional measures for ARB and other state agencies. So every year, the state agencies are supposed to report on how they're doing toward that. It's going to go to the legislature, and it'll be publicly available on the internet also. Okay, so the 2 questions for the webcast. One is, will the delay in the economic analysis affect the implementation of the plan? The answer is no. Our intention is we're anticipating it's not even going to affect when the board's going to hear the plan. So we're still planning to go to the board in November of this year. So nothing should be delayed. And then the second question is, will the scoping plan address the use of any revenue? And this is kind of another level of detail in a cap and trade in a fee program. Obviously, there's going to be money raised, be a lot of money. In a cap and trade program, the permission to emit CO2 is in the form of what they call an allowance. And so one of the big questions if you go with a cap and trade is, do you give the allowances away or do you auction them? And that's a huge debate. And depending on whether you own a factory or not, you probably sit on different sides of the debate. And the different programs that are out there now have taken different approaches. If you auction the allowances, any of them, you could have a lot of money. And so the scoping plan will discuss potential uses for revenue that can be generated. The revenue could be used for all kinds of things like funding research into technologies that can help us move forward. It can go to help improve the energy efficiency of people's homes, which could help offset the impact of any potential rate increases. It could go for incentives to, have businesses do things they wouldn't normally have done. There's a huge variety of different revenue could be used. It will address that. Thanks.